Welcome to Urbanism Vancouver, a podcast that explores how our built environment shapes our everyday lives and community experiences. I'm your host, Helen Lui. Join me as we discover where we live, work, and play, and how we can shape better communities. With each episode, we'll bring a bit of insight and industry experience from myself and my guests. We'll dive into the inner workings of our urban surroundings and explore how places are planned, designed, and built, and discuss ways to create more livable, equitable, and sustainable cities. I hope that you'll learn a little and be inspired to be more curious and more involved in impacting positive change. Before we get started today, we want to acknowledge that this podcast is recorded and produced on the traditional and unceded territories of the Coast Salish peoples, including the Musqueam, Squamish, and the Tsleil-Waututh nations. We pay our respects to their elders past, present, and emerging, and recognize the enduring connection they have to this land. We strive to have our conversations contribute towards reconciliation and work towards sustainability and equity for all the custodians of the lands. We've heard lots about the theories of good urbanism, but what's next? Joining us today to talk about education, awareness, and engagement of urban content is Uytae Lee, well known for his urbanism content and YouTube channel called About Here.
It's my absolute pleasure to be here, Helen, and I am feeling incredibly nervous because this is the finale.
This is the finale.
The last say.
People know you from About Here and from the amazing videos that you do, but mostly because you do such a good job of balancing the storytelling and the research to be informative. But what drives you? Tell us how you got there. Why do you make videos? Why are you interested in this stuff?
I'll give you some context. I was an urban planning student out in Halifax, Nova Scotia, and me and my friends, we would see that there was all this content online around, I think at the time it was channels like Veritasium or Smarter Everyday, really hardcore physics channels kind of popping off. And we're like, man, if people are really interested in how atoms work or something, I don't know, this is not my expertise, but where's all the content around urban planning? And kind of in tandem with that, as urban planning students, we were one of the few young people to show up at a public hearing or a engagement session around some sort of policy that the city was rolling out. And just seeing the to put it bluntly, the woeful lack of representation of, a lot of people in many of these kind of really consequential meetings, we kind of all felt like it would be good to make this stuff a bit more accessible. And really, to me, that's what this all boils down to is I feel like a lot of us live in our cities. The analogy I like to use is kind of like fish in an aquarium. You're just sort of swimming around and as long as the water's comfortable, you don't really think too much about all of the complex technology and infrastructure that makes your life possible. But I think fish are not able to redesign their aquarium every now and then, and there's no politics. I'm imagining an aquarium, but I feel like in a city, you kind of have to remember oh man, the city around us is really molded by humans. It's been molded by people throughout history, and we really have an opportunity to do that too. And so at least that's the altruistic version of why I do this now.
I don't know the sources that you cited, those channels, but in my head, there are a couple that make science really cool, make all these other things really cool. And why can't we have the same storytelling and intrigue when it comes to urban planning?
Totally.
Because it has so much impact on our everyday lives.
Yeah, that's totally the thesis. I mean, atoms for sure are a part of our everyday. Should I drop this thread? Maybe I'll drop this thread. But yeah, that it is at the end of the day, all of these decisions around zoning or transportation policy, it is affecting your literal daily life. And, it's good to be in the know of, at least aware of how those decisions are being made.
Do you find that it's difficult to package together a video because there's so much, right? And everything can go off.
You see my upload rate. You see
a million, right? Tangents.
Mm-hmm.
How do you go about scoping and packaging and making sure that there's enough meat there for people to truly dive into the issue and know where to get involved, but then at the same time, like keep it to a nice, engaging 15-minute or 30-minute video, right?
You are describing my daily struggle, and I don't even know if I do it particularly well. I write very slowly, and I think, admittedly, sometimes pretty slowly as well. I'll say that, yeah, I feel like so many urban planning issues can just become like an everything issue. And, I'm sure you're well aware of it. Housing, it's kind of like a sweater. You pull at one thread and like just the whole thing kind of unravels. And I have very much written myself into manic states by like just trying to, I think like there were many sort of tried and failed video ideas that were me like really being way too ambitious at the start as to what one video could accomplish. If I had to boil down like how I try to approach it now, I feel like a good way to approach a story and a good way to kind of scope out a story at the beginning is to really think about what question your story is about. I think any good story kind of has a good question in it because you're delivering something to people that they probably don't know much about. If they already knew about it, why would they watch your story or read your article? Really boiling down what that question is, I think kind of works well as a good signpost where you need to stop your story, where some context might be a bit too much. But my gosh, I would be kidding myself if I said it was an easy process. I think every video I always have some like crisis moment where I'm like, I think I'm trying to solve like some fundamental question of the universe and I need to come back down from the stratosphere and try to make sense of what this means kind of in the real world.
Well, we only see the finished product and,
Yeah.
and it's very rational. It all makes sense.
Oh, shucks. I'm glad it comes off that way. Yeah, no.
No, it's really good. Why do you think that, aside from the fact that everything is very interconnected, why do you think urban planning as like a topic is so complex to educate or talk about?
Yeah, I think to your point, it is a very interconnected, like all of the issues feel very interconnected. Like housing is very interconnected with transportation. In some ways, it's very interconnected with like the banking system and like the lending system. And like, oh my God, like, you can see like, my head exploding already. But I think the added challenge is that it's such a tangible, sort of relatable issue for a lot of people that it's hard to talk about it in a theoretical level because at the end of the day, these are everyday people's neighborhoods, commutes, lives. And to put it more like tangibly, like I know that if I make a video and I talk about a neighbor, like there's nuance that you have to get into. Otherwise, people will be like, you're wrong.
A lot of it is very theoretical in terms of the theories and the practice and like, best design principles or whatever. But they land in a reality that affect real people in their communities, in their neighborhoods, especially when you're trying to like use examples like an Olympic Village or a Seawall or whatever, right? Those are real people who have experiences and associations.
Yeah, you put it a lot more eloquently. Like if I can try to rephrase that, I think it's like something that is totally, you can speak about it on a higher theoretical level, but at the end of the day, there's so much variation city by city, and there's so many caveats I think, I find are worth mentioning. So it's not even so much the interconnectedness of these issues, but it's also like the way they manifest themselves on the ground. Like Vancouver's housing market is also like just really different from Toronto's housing market or like Saskatoon's housing market. I feel like by speaking about it on such a high level, you risk really not making it relevant to people on the ground.
What are your thoughts in terms of the landscape of coverage that we have currently? Or I guess
yeah.
I'll ask that from tell me about what your thoughts are of the information available, when you started making videos versus maybe now.
So I've been doing this sort of video making for 10 years now, or it will be 10 years this summer.
That's pretty big.
And
Congrats.
So,
yeah.
gosh, well, thank you. I'm surprised I've made it this far, to be honest with you. But, and so, yeah, like when we started this, as I said before, there was not much about urban planning at all. And I think a lot of the work we had to do, and I say we because it was the first channel I started was sort of like a group student project. I started with my best friend in Halifax at the time. And what we talked a lot about when we were writing was like, how do we just get people to care about these issues in the first place? Like, how do you just like even explain a zoning bylaw? But I think increasingly, and I wouldn't be the first to say this, like urban planning is totally having a moment, and there are so many channels covering it, which I'm so happy to see. And the issues are much more discussed in the public sphere, or like way more people know about these issues than before.
Yeah.
And so I feel like in many ways, I'm really excited that there's like been a real public consciousness awakening around local policy. But I do see some gaps in that, landscape. I think it's kind of really evident to me that a lot of that awareness, for better or for worse, is driven by social media and like YouTubers like myself. And I guess I don't even need to mention the big channels, but there are like massive TikTok channels, YouTube channels, all like talking about urban planning. But that's coincided with like a real loss of local journalism and just the challenges of making local news just workable as a business model at all these days. And so, while we have a lot of YouTubers talking about urban planning on kind of like a higher level, I think the local coverage has weakened in some ways, or that it's not quite as prominent as I think it really should be. Because like I said before, like ultimately so many of these urban planning ideas manifest themselves on a city by city level where the context can vary quite widely. And then the other thing I feel like is missing from the landscape is that the planners and the municipalities and the organizations actually doing some of the planning work still really struggle to communicate what they're doing. Not that us YouTubers don't do a good job unpacking some of these things, but it would be great, if your municipality is publishing a plan, like they have a really great communications and video strategy to really accompany that. And so I have a lot of mixed feelings about, I guess, the moment that urban planning content is in right now.
You mentioned like some of the people doing the work, like municipalities, planners, not having maybe the most multi-pronged or robust strategy when it comes to communicating what they're doing. Like, why is that? I mean, like, clearly you went to planning school. You're like very well versed in zoning bylaws and whatnot. And surely there are young people who work in planning as well. Is it an issue of cities and planners needing to catch up with the technology? Is it like a prudence to how they come about describing what they're doing?
Both. I think there are some things that are just, I remember reading how like Halifax, it just recently got rid of the requirement to post about public hearings in a paper newspaper. And there's some mixed feelings about that as well. Like,
Right.
Obviously those are ad dollars that were going to local journalism. But I do think, there's some catching up that cities are doing right now and recognizing just how much public engagement and discussion happens on social media. I love that more and more planners are kind of recognizing that and using those platforms as a way to engage with the public. I think there are some more fundamental tensions at play as well, though. I've worked with municipalities and government organizations as well as my YouTube stuff. And the common challenge I run into, and it's a very understandable one, is that a lot of the communications priorities of these organizations are much more driven by risk aversion than really telling a compelling story. I think at the core of a lot of good stories is problem solution. And to be able to talk about a solution and to convince people that a solution really is necessary and it matters, you have to be able to say that there is a problem, that some things aren't working well right now. But I find that a lot of organizations, as soon as you broach them with like, hey, in order to like prop up this policy that you are wanting the public to know about, you have to talk about the issues that currently exist in the municipality or the organization. But I think it can be quite at odds with the typical approach to communications within these organizations. At the core of a lot of good stories, you kind of want to set up a problem or an issue before you set up a solution or an idea to address that. There's really no other way of getting someone to care about why an idea or a solution matters without first identifying problems. I think for a lot of organizations and a lot of communications departments, that identifying the problem and setting up the problem part is really challenging to incorporate and to kind of grapple with.
Actually, that's a really good point. And when I take that and apply it specifically to like housing as an example, so many municipalities and so much engagement that has been done on the idea of density doesn't come with the story of like, why are we doing this, right? And it's about also identifying the issue of, well, the issue is, a lot of the impact of some of the low density things that we've had, some of the impacts of building our communities around the car, right? But it's such a touchy conversation because then it goes back to, what you're saying about you identify that as an issue. Are you telling people that the way their communities are and our neighborhoods are wrong, right? Like it's not that. It's just reassessing, right? The needs for now and the future and what's a way to proceed that gives more housing opportunities for more people. And I think that's the duality of like, you're trying to point out a problem to sell a story that then promotes a good solution that we want. But in order to do that, it's hard and it's a difficult conversation for people who already exist in the communities who don't see anything wrong with the way it is.
For sure. You have to take on some risk of alienating a part of your audience. Now, I do want to caveat that by saying, like, I don't think you have to really alienate people to like tell a good story. I mean, one thing I really like to do is like just find the common problem that everyone can agree is an issue. Like, I did a video on why fewer children are walking or cycling to school. And I really feel like in retrospect, though I didn't think of it at the time, it was such a good entry point for kind of anyone across the political spectrum to engage with ideas of active transportation and mode shift without getting people's backs up. Because you look at the lineup of vans and SUVs outside of school, and I don't think anyone would look at that and be like, this is awesome. This is a thing that should be celebrated here. So to me, like, I think there's a real art and a skill in being able to open a story and set up a problem in a way that gets as many people as possible to be curious about it. But, to your point, I think even kind of entertaining some of that can feel very risky for kind of your traditional kind of communications department.
Your point about the art of nailing the problem and the context in a way that invites people as opposed to like polarizes it is so important, especially in an age where content is almost always digital.
Totally.
How do you even go about doing that in a graceful way compared to going into a room, right, where you have all the people there and you can go, okay, this is how I'm going to engage with these specific people to invite them all in.
Yeah.
Yes, you can't do that online. So how do you go about doing that so that you're not polarizing your potential audience? Do you go about doing like a bit of research into what the current takes are on, a specific issue so that you kind of understand where the polarization is, if there is any?
You know what this reminds me of is I had to kind of put down a policy for myself a few years ago where I was going to very intentionally make friends with people who are not urban planners. Because it is so easy.
Good goal.
Well, I mean, nothing against urban planners. A lot of them are really lovely people. But I found that like, this profession can really quickly get insular and kind of build up assumptions that when you test it outside of our core group, you realize how perhaps alien it might feel or perhaps threatening it might feel to some people. And so, yeah, to your point, like a lot of how I start writing is just I'm the guy that brings planning up at the dinner table and, tries to like test out a pitch and see how things land with people, but also like what gets their curiosity up about it. I think it does serve that dual purpose. Like if you talk with someone about your story idea, you'll sort of understand what takes are kind of just off base, but you'll also really get a good sense of what are those components that really get an idea and the importance of an idea to click with somebody. But there's so many different things to consider. I do think if you have the intention of doing that going into a video, that's like half the battle. And I feel like it is quite easy as someone who makes videos about this stuff to kind of, the content that's going to either be the rage bait or to really, it gets preached to the choir. And I also want to say, I don't see anything fundamentally wrong with those videos necessarily. I think it's important to have stories that are really about rallying your base and getting people feeling validated about genuine frustrations they have about their cities. But then there's a place for content, hopefully like mine, that is a bit more trying to reach people on the other sides of topics. Yeah, I think kind of quite early on in my own work, I guess like made the promise to myself that I wanted this to be about reaching people who wouldn't normally engage with urban planning issues. And I think in doing that requires you to really try to test out your ideas and empathize with people that aren't like so embedded in your profession or viewpoint.
Right. I think everyone in this industry needs to do more of that.
Have a policy.
Well, no, just engage regularly with people that are not in your industry.
Yeah. You know what I will say? I'll add one more fun, I don't know, weird anecdote. For a while in Vancouver, like the first place I moved into other than my parents' basement was a wonderful gentleman who lived in like a single family home. He owned the house. He rented out for super cheap. And I mean, if he's listening to this podcast, I say this lovingly, but Baruj, you were a real NIMBY at times. and I had a lot of conversations with him, like kind of understanding his viewpoint and perspective. And it did help me understand like what are some of the core concerns. I don't want to paint it as like NIMBYism, like why people kind of get quite politically active around these issues. And it's not necessarily the most like politically rational stuff. Sometimes it's just like, this is a really great friend group I have now, and we just hang out at public engagement sessions and we like to complain about how the neighborhood is changing, and that's what we bond over. I really, and I think you can kind of, begin to like humanize them a bit.
In your example, you're talking about people creating a bond and coming together over this shared hobby of, I guess, opposing densification or opposing new housing. I wonder, does that have anything to do with, deterioration of our sense of belonging in our communities? And
For sure.
You know how during COVID, after COVID, like it really hit us that we've really lost a lot of those social connections, right? Our sense of belonging, our sense of feeling like trust, and we know the people in our community really kind of fell apart, especially as we were physically constrained as to, how we can move about. I'm curious whether that breakdown furthers polarization and makes people feel more easily like us and them.
You bring up such a larger issue in all this. And I would agree. I think there's a lot of research out there now talking about the issue of social isolation and people feeling, at least within their physical communities, a loss of connection, and a loss of connection across generations. I would have no doubt that that is certainly playing a bit of a role. I think it's really telling that one of the most compelling talking points for people who own single family homes for why they should want more density in their neighborhoods is really around like making sure that their children have a place to move into and that their children can stay. So I think those like bonds really do build and provide the foundation blocks for discourse that's a bit more empathetic.
Do you have any experiences just trying to connect with people who clearly just have a very opposing view on an issue? Do you generally try to educate or bring more awareness in that example? Like how, because that's always something that I find, right? Is we try to do all this work about advocacy and bringing awareness, but half the time we're preaching to the choir. And the only place that it actually matters is the people who don't already agree with you.
Totally.
Right? That's where the actual impact and benefit comes from.
Mm-hmm.
So I've always found it a fun thing to do, but also can be quite frustrating. And
Okay. If I share my stuff, I'd be very curious to hear like kind of how you handle situations like that. I'll give you one example. I was surprised to hear, but it's happened to me multiple times at this point. But if you talk to kind of the average person about this thing called view cones, these protected views we have up from certain streets and certain locations to the mountains in Vancouver, I think you would find that the vast majority of people feel that those view cones are very, very important. And I will admit that like really, I think like if you really are in the weeds of housing policy and restrictions, this is one of the most significant restrictions we have, especially since that those view cones seem to come from low density areas to areas where there really could be a lot more high density. And to me, I think that is an instance where like I allowed that to sort of influence my thinking. Sometimes even us pro-housing advocates need to not be zealots about housing everywhere and as much as possible, regardless of anyone's feelings. First off, I don't think that would really track well with the average person, but I also do feel like when I think about planning, it isn't just about housing. It's just that like when housing becomes an issue, like everything sort of kind of goes to the wayside and you just like are in this game of deprioritizing other planning objectives to just get the housing under control. But I have to remind myself, I enjoy those views too. And maybe there is a very good sort of maybe less tangible reason why we should be protecting some of those view planes. The line where I would educate or where I push back are when I'm confronted with beliefs that I think are actually like come from misinformation and isn't just like an opinion. And so things about that new apartment that's being built in your neighborhood is going to make the rest of the rents in that neighborhood expensive. Like I think that's kind of a take that to the average person kind of feels true. You have this new building coming next to you and the rents are like double the rents you're paying. And so you think, oh man, my landlord's going to look at that and think, okay, I got to jack up the rents for you. But I feel like it's so much more nuanced than that. And it's really overly simplistic to think that the new building is the cause of the higher rents and not the symptom, if that makes sense at all. So I think that's kind of where I would draw the line. I just know this is kind of factually wrong and I can validate the feeling, but I'll add another factor. It also depends on like how much I care about the person too. I think to some extent you can't like argue every, random person on the street, but like, if it's like my mom comes to me with a real NIMBY take, I'll be like, Mom, you got an hour or two? Let me talk to you about housing economics. But I'm curious about you. Like, I'm sure people at this point know of a lot of your opinions online and might disagree with you. And, how do you kind of approach these?
I think our bubble of the people that I say we or like me that I know definitely is very insular, as you say. And outside of that little bubble, no one knows that I have these takes. But because why would they, right? Like they just live normal lives unimpeded by the symptom of being permanently online. But
it's a good reminder too.
Yeah, it's a great reminder. And outside of that, I feel like in those rare moments where I have the opportunity to deeply engage with random strangers, it's usually through things like maybe like a public engagement event for work, or I don't know, like a random party that I went to where I was like, yep, I'm going to go down that rabbit hole and see where this takes me for the next 2 hours.
Yeah. Do you ever out yourself as a developer at a party? You're like,
oh, always. I love to caveat. I'm a developer shell. This is my take. When I'm at public engagement events, I specifically seek out the people that I know that are going to be opposed, and mostly because I find that for the people who are working on the team, it's challenging to talk to those people. And I think that it's not easy to do. And I'm happy to take that on because it doesn't really bother me as much. But also, I think for certain people who are opposed, my goal is not to ever convince them that you must see things the way that I see it. Maybe just to impart on them that the view that they hold so strongly, maybe challenge that a little bit, maybe help them see that there are other people who see a different view for their community, for the future, and that perhaps the reasons why they want that is equally valid in the way that, their views and feelings are also valid.
Right. Yeah, that's lovely advice. Yeah. And, it reminded me of a tactic I also use, and not necessarily honestly sometimes. So I'll pull this in both conversations and in my videos. I'll say like, I used to think this way. I used to think that way. But then I, saw this evidence and I saw this piece of information and I whatever. And now I think this way. I think it's a good way to sort of both validate and make someone feel like you have been in their shoes and empathized with their opinions, but then also give space for your own ideas. Because like I think once you frame it in any sort of opinion in the interests or in the perspective of whoever you're talking to, I think they're much more open to kind of understanding, oh, like you used to think the way I did. Oh, how did you get to your conclusions then? You know?
Right. It's like creating a bridge or offering a connection.
I'll always be very happy to completely dress myself down in order to, help someone else change their mind.
This might be a bit of like a difficult question to answer, but clearly you do this work because you care and you want to educate and you want to bring awareness. How do you go about measuring impact and success of your work?
Oh gosh, that is a difficult question to answer to some extent. I'll tell you that the reason why I do this work is undeniably tied to a feeling I have about the impact I'm having. But ultimately, I've landed on the conclusion that I can't let that be the driver of the videos. I think the easiest indicator you can think about for whatever impact you're having when you're in the business of making internet content is likes, comments, views, whatever, right? And I think that is definitely one of the more compelling indicators of, some impact you're having, but it's certainly not the only thing. And my observation is that anytime like one of my videos crosses 1 million views, which is crazy to even think about, but when I look at the analytics of that, it's because that the message went really, really broad and went to a lot of different countries, but it didn't quite find its voice more locally. But I've done like videos on like, more niche local topics that definitely don't garner as many views. But when I peel back the analytics, it's like, wow, like a lot of people in Vancouver saw this. I have local policymakers or politicians reaching out to me saying like how much they appreciated that video. To me, I really see that as in many ways more meaningful of a metric. But I also don't want to make any sort of kind of pretend that like videos is what gets stuff done, that really changes the world. I think certainly shapes the conversation. And I think you wouldn't be able to have some like the cultural change without communication, without people learning about ideas and changing their opinions or getting really fired up about certain things. But I constantly remind myself and other people that like, that's like really the first step of many to actually kind of having a direct impact in your community.
It's like the traditional means of measuring, content success. It does not equate the depth of where that material has gone. I mean, you've made so many good videos, but my favorite one is always the seawall in terms of like local. I walk the seawall all the time, but never once walking on the seawall in my life have I thought, yeah, why aren't there businesses here? Right? You sparked something that impacts people locally, but is something that I would have never thought. And yet I live and breathe this stuff. Why did I not think of that? Right? So to me, that's the point of having more resources, having more conversations. It's like to elevate maybe the starting point of where we're having these discussions.
I really appreciate you saying that. That's so meaningful to hear. And I think those are the anecdotes that really make me feel like I'm having a tangible impact is when I meet someone who's watched a video and they tell me they changed their mind about something. On a couple occasions, I've heard from people who told me like they pursued a degree in urban planning because of and I think that's a comment a lot of urban planning YouTubers get, which I'm like, man, that is a lot riding on.
Yeah.
me.
I don't know if I support
I don't know if you're going to enjoy. I think I am not practicing urban planning for a very good reason because the ideas we talk about and the reality of, how you work within it as a professional, I think can be wildly different. I feel really good about a video when like I feel good about the story to some extent. Like I feel like I learned something. I went into it and I kind of changed my mind in some way. Something around like, the friends we made along the way, that kind of vibe, to some extent, it's impossible to measure like, what your video does. That's fine. But I think to me, consistently writing stories that align with my core philosophy and, my intentions with storytelling, I think that's kind of the truest impact I feel anyways, as the guy making these things.
What are some of the challenges and opportunities you see as it relates to, the discourse about urban planning or the possibilities from here on forward?
Oh gosh, yeah. Yeah, what is my advice for Vancouver?
Yeah.
I really think that the opportunity and challenge, the opportunity is like we have a very diverse population. We have a lot of people from different backgrounds, and man, you'll like find so many cool and interesting pockets of cultures. I had a friend who went to Japan recently and like had Japanese ramen and whatever, and was like, dude, like it's very similar to the ramen you find here. Maybe I've
That's
pissed off
good.
some
That's
Japanese
very
people, but
validating.
yeah, right?
Yeah.
But like, I feel like that's truly something that I feel often gets overlooked in what makes Vancouver so interesting, at least from the urban planners. I think, regular people will tell you, oh yeah, we got like such a crazy food scene, so much interesting cultural diversity. But I don't know if like urban planning necessarily celebrates that. Like Vancouverism doesn't really quite capture, like you can also get like some of the best pho in the continent in the city.
Yes.
And I think there could be a really interesting way to capture that or celebrate that a little bit more in our urban planning. But I think to some extent, it's also a bit of a challenge. And to your point earlier, Helen, I feel like sometimes the city, what it struggles with more than, I'm not going to say housing, but like, I think there was like some sort of Vancouver Foundation study that said like, oh, like social isolation is actually the top thing that people care about. This sort of, I don't know, like isolation or distrust of each other that really gets in the way of us kind of, leaning into that.
That's so interesting you bring that up, because just the concept of urban planning, and it could be a whole other episode diving into its origins and what perspective most of that comes from, right? But it doesn't really easily lend itself to diversity.
Totally.
When you're trying to have prescriptive rules about what makes good design, what makes good spaces, it's hard to nail down performance metrics as opposed to just saying like, have a setback and it'll be great, right? Like,
yeah, no, totally. Like culture is so much more difficult to quantify. And I don't even know if it would ever be a fruitful exercise to try to quantify, cultural KPIs, let's say. But I agree with you. Like a lot of professions in life, it's easier to focus on the more aesthetic qualities of planning than some of those like deeper things that, really form the roots of why people appreciate and love their communities. When housing is so expensive, any other priority kind of goes out the window. I really do think like housing, for me at least, is a very boring issue. Or at least like the policies are really just become interesting because to me, the housing is expensive and that's why I care. Housing being expensive kind of has a way of divvying up neighborhoods by income and wealth rather than through any other metric. And I don't mean that like we should be like, I don't know, you know what I mean? Like I'm not like we need to have divisive neighbors, but I feel like to some extent there are so many other interesting metrics for why someone might choose a neighborhood that they want to live in other than it was the most affordable thing I could find within my budget,
Yeah.
And to me, like, and especially knowing that like so much immigrant culture and interesting culture generally happens at like the affordable end of the spectrum. I think that is kind of one of the under-recognized costs of the housing crisis is that we have been very good at creating diverse neighborhoods in the sense that we have really rich neighborhoods and like really less rich neighborhoods. When we have like neighbors that affordability isn't as much of a issue and people have the agency to choose which neighborhoods they want to live in for more than just financial reasons, I think that's when you get really interesting bits of culture coming up.
When the cost of housing and the lack of secure housing is such a prevalent issue, it makes social economic status the forefront of like everything.
100%. Yeah.
And you can go into the different topics of urban planning and great design and beautiful spaces, but if your barrier to everything is your social economic status, then those other conversations almost become a moot point.
Yeah. We've really created neighborhoods that are divided by socioeconomic status more than anything else. And we kind of miss out on some of the other like wonderful kind of, what is it called? Like the agglomeration effect, where like people aren't choosing a neighborhood just because there's the socioeconomic status they're in, but like this is where they feel like their culture is, or this is matches with their identity the most.
It almost ties back to like our earlier conversation about ties in the community, right? Like if you are living in a community because that's the area you can afford, and therefore that's the area that most people can only afford is a certain neighborhood, then your physical community is most often going to be bound by people of similar backgrounds. And you're not getting that social interaction with people who maybe earn higher income or earn lower income. Like just that level of diversity isn't really being represented across the city in all neighborhoods. And as a result, maybe you have erosion of trust and empathy for people who are different from you because you're just physically never surrounded by people who, can't afford to live in your neighborhood. That's really sad that is
the state of
the effect of the high cost of housing or the affordability crisis.
For sure.
Is there anything that you recommend in terms of what an average listener or person can do to learn more and be more educated about urban planning issues in order to help us all get to a place where we can constructively engage, discuss, and find solutions that improve our built environment?
Yeah, I love that question because to me, that's what ideally my videos are about. And I do hope that the videos are just like a first step to someone getting much more deeply involved and passionate about these issues. I think some of the most rewarding experiences people can have is just getting involved in these local advocacy groups on the ground around planning issues like housing or transportation. Some of the really big hot button issues in urban planning right now, like housing affordability and there's transportation, there are really well organized, exciting, I don't even know if I'd call it organization, like friend groups even. Like you'll go to these things and it's just like, you meet up for beers and you talk about housing policy. And if that sounds like, something you're ready for, I found that to be some of the most rewarding stuff. And I say that a little bit with a kind of wink in my eye because Helen, I know you're super active on the ground, like organizing this sort of stuff. And I really can't thank you enough for being such a welcoming and like empathetic figure for people who are curious about these spaces, having attended or like been a part of sort of local housing meetups here in Vancouver. Like I really just love the tone that people set here. There's never this sort of thought of, like if you don't understand pro forma or whatever thing, like you don't belong here. I don't ever get that sense. It's really like if you care about the issues we care about, like you're a very welcome face. And so that's what I would readily put out there as like kind of a great next step for anyone who's looking to go beyond just consuming and watching urban planning content online. And then to me, I don't think I could ever recommend people getting into content creation. There are many other side effects that they don't tell you about when you put yourself very publicly online. But I do think like to some extent, it is really the best ways to also start is just focusing on one issue, and you don't have to kind of solve it all. There's sort of the next step after going to a meetup is you champion one issue. Like there's one policy thing that has been implemented and does well in other cities. You'd really like to get that going over here. You can call your counselor. You can maybe make a video with a lot of, I don't know, maybe don't show yourself on camera. I don't know. But I mean, I think I'm a real testament to that. Like, I think that it really started to click when I started focusing on specific issues and practicing that muscle of communicating and making and advocating. I think it really gets you going. It doesn't just have to be conversations. It can be a little bit more pointed than that.
Yeah. I think that is a very wise suggestion to like start with one and like kind of make it your thing. And also because it's not realistic for everyone to advocate for everything and then be super plugged in on everything. We would just all be burnt out, like, because we're all just like doing this kind of, aside from your specific content creation, which is your job, like getting involved in all the other periphery stuff, that's our free time. Like you talking to me here is at your own free time and we are not paying you for it.
What?
So
wait,
no, there's no
cancel this now. I want a cut of the sponsor. No, I'm kidding. Sorry.
We need a diversity in voices. We need a diversity of champions who are really passionate about their one thing so that we can kind of move the needle across the board.
I'd be remiss to not mention my partner, Alana, for being a huge part of why the videos are written so well and written the way they are. And important to highlight her. So I think definitely part of the writing process is having someone whose voice and thought process you really trust. And also helpful that she's not an urban planner. She's if I can in any way fit in a shout out to her for really being such a important co-writer in all this, it would be much appreciated.
Yeah, of course. Happy to. And I think that's really nice and really important to highlight because often with content creation, we get to see your face and everything, but there's a team of effort. Yeah. Thank you so much for chatting with us. It was a really nice way to kind of like reflect back on the conversations we had, with other people in the season, but hopefully trying to inspire other people to be curious, to watch your videos, to talk about the things that are important and impact all of us. I think for a lot of people in Vancouver and around the world, your content is just like the pillar of the tone that we want to address when it comes to advocacy, right? So I'm just really grateful that you came to chat with me today, and I look forward to more videos.
Thanks so much, Helen. That's so nice of you to say. The honor is all mine. It's such a pleasure to be on your podcast. Yeah, thanks so much for having me.
Urban issues are important, but they're also challenging to talk about. One way to increase awareness and education about the workings of our surroundings is through digital content. However, as we heard from Uytae, it's really difficult to create good content for urbanism. That's because urban issues are so multifaceted, and they exist both in theory and in lived experience. On the one hand, we have a variety of professionals who live and breathe the theories of good urban design, where they dream about transforming our cities into ideal concepts. On the other hand, our cities are comprised of real communities, buildings, and everything in between, all of which have intangible significance to the people within our cities. However, it's so important that we talk about how we shape our cities in a way that supports everyone. And the only way we can do this is through building and connecting within our community and engaging with compassion even when we have differing values and opinions. It also requires transparency and an ability to identify problems even when they're complex and difficult to resolve. That's why it's so important for us all to learn, engage, and take action in our cities. Whether it's through talking about urban issues with your friends and family, or showing up at city meetings to share your thoughts. Your voice matters. Use it. Vote, engage, and ensure that your voice is represented in the future of our cities. You've been listening to Urbanism Vancouver, the podcast dedicated to bettering our built environment. Be sure to follow us on your listening platform of choice so you don't miss our future releases. I'm Helen Lui. Thanks for listening. This podcast series was independently funded and produced by myself and Aaron Johnson. Visit us at urbanismvancouver.com.